Hi, my name is Caroline Poland, and I'm the founder and CEO of Poland & Associates Consulting. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about what the window of tolerance means for those of you who are athletes. Have you ever been out on the field and found that your mind just kind of goes blank, or you're out on the court and you get so angry that it's just hard to think straight? Or maybe you can't let go something that someone said earlier and that's beginning to mess with your focus. Maybe you step up to the ball and your heart is racing so hard that it's just hard to focus or think straight. So if you've had any of these experiences, then what you might be dealing with is your window of tolerance. So remember, the window of tolerance is just that zone or range that you can optimally function in. Think about it as that range in which you can experience a hard situation or a difficult emotion, and you're able to regulate your way through that instead of kicking into fight, flight, or freeze. We all have difficult emotions and difficult experiences, but sometimes our ability to regulate through that difficult emotion or situation becomes a little bit more than we can manage, and we start to feel stuck in that emotion. And sometimes it feels like we're either stuck on or stuck off. And when that happens, we are outside of our window of tolerance. So again, with window of tolerance, we're looking at that zone that we can optimally regulate and function in without flipping into fight or flight or freeze mode. And with that, we're looking at either hyperarousal or hypoarousal. And the symptoms of those are So once we get outside of that window of tolerance, and we go from our prefrontal cortex back into our amygdala, we get activated and we start to lose access to our prefrontal cortex. And that's where executive function and wise decision making is. And of course, those are things that we really need when we're in the middle of a game or an athletic performance. And when we start to get outside of our window of tolerance and we start to not be able to regulate, we get too stuck in one of our emotions, then we don't have access to those things, and that impacts our game. So what we really need to do is learn to stay in our window of tolerance and regulate effectively. Again, it's not about the emotions that you experience, it's about how you regulate through the emotions that you experience. So take anger as an example. Anger is one of the things that can happen when we get too high above our window of tolerance and we go into hyperarousal. And again, we can have anger and regulate well through it, but there's also anger that we flip too high. And so take, for example, a call that's made out on the field that you disagree with, and naturally you get angry about it. So your choices are to either regulate through that, or if your anger is outside of your window of tolerance, then it might feel like you're hijacked by that emotion, and that anger will grow increasingly bigger, and you start to lose access to that prefrontal cortex where you can think clearly and decision make in wise ways, which will negatively impact your game. I also want to take a minute to mention coaches. So if you have a coach who doesn't stay within their window of tolerance, where they either get above in hyperarousal or below in hypoarousal, it can make it very hard for individual players or for the team as a whole to stay within their window of tolerance. And because our nervous systems are designed to regulate and co-regulate off of one another, if a coach is dysregulated, it is very hard for his or her players to stay regulated as well. And I've talked about this in other window of tolerance videos, but that's when we're in any sort of people helping profession or leadership or supervisory position. It calls us to constant work on ourselves, because our ability or inability to regulate through hard emotions or difficult situations really impacts those around us. And so if you're a coach watching this, this is part of your work in being a good coach, is to not only learn about the window of tolerance so that you can help your individual players, but so that you can continue to widen that window of tolerance as well. And that way you can be a healthy co-regulator for your players if they start to get a little dysregulated or a situation happens out on the field or the court that gets them outside of their window of tolerance. If you are a player and you have a coach who regularly is outside of their window of tolerance, I hope that this will normalize this a little bit for you and maybe help give an explanation for why you might hit into panic or hypervigilance or anxiety or just kind of freeze and go into shutdown mode when someone's nervous system across from us is dysregulated, and that can not only trigger off things that have happened in our past where someone else has been outside of their window of tolerance, but it can be really hard for us to regulate within ours as well. When we talk about the window of tolerance, what can we do within athletic programs? What can you as athletes do to work with your window of tolerance so that you can really boost your athletic performance within that window of tolerance? And for coaches, what can you do to integrate the window of tolerance and widening that window of tolerance in a healthy way for individual members of your team, as well as for the team as a whole, so that you can boost athletic performance? So my first recommendation would be that we need program-wide psychoeducation on what the window of tolerance is, how that impacts our nervous system, and what it looks like when we get above or below it, what hyperarousal or hypoarousal looks like. And I think it's really important for this to be system-wide, because every individual person's window of tolerance is going to look different. And so those things that act as the activating events that kick us off and get us outside of our window of tolerance are going to be a little bit different for each person. So to have team-wide or athletic department-wide conversations about this window of tolerance, A, normalizes it, because everyone has a window of tolerance and we're all going to get above or below it sometimes. But B, it allows us to then create individualized plans for players on what that can actually look like and how each person not only gets triggered in gameplay, but also maybe gets triggered outside of the game that is impacting the game. We really want to normalize this so that we're not creating shame for mental health in the same way that there's not shame for physical health. This program-wide education could also involve mindfulness training and understanding how to get present in your body and what those individual body-based cues and shifts look like. If we start to move outside of our window of tolerance and we can catch that early on, then it doesn't have the chance to hijack us and really flip us too high or too low. And again, anything we can do within athletic performance to keep our prefrontal cortex engaged is just a benefit for athletic performance, whether that's for the individual or for the team as a whole. My second strategy would be to understand what events or thoughts and word-based phrases act as activating events for you. Everyone's activating event is going to be a little bit different, and that involves a lot of curiosity and observation for you in your own life to understand what are those situations that act as that activating event that start to boost you into anxiety or panic or hypervigilance, anger, shame, hopelessness, kind of the shutdown, dissociation, brain fog. Every person is going to have different activating events. And for you to understand what those activating events are for you is taking control of your own body. And understanding this will boost your athletic performance. So examples of words or phrases that might be activating would be catastrophizing language, where one mistake ends up at total failure, or where we've ruined something for the quarter or for the half or for the game as a whole, where we start to put negative language on us as athletic participants. If we are using all or nothing language, where we're either a total success or a total failure and there's nothing in between, those kinds of words we know from research tends to be activating words and actually leads us further into experiences of anxiety and depression. So being really curious about that for yourself will boost athletic performance. For coaches, again, having conversations about those words and those phrases that we use, I think is really important, because if we make this a team-wide culture, we can begin to support one another. Our nervous systems grow and develop in community and relationship. We're designed for it. And so if we can create that as a team culture, we're going to collectively boost our performance. My third strategy would just be to let the emotion be the emotion without having to react to it. And what I mean by that is, if we have an emotion and we can just notice it and begin to regulate through it, then we don't have to react to that. So it's the idea that we don't have to be anxious about getting anxious, or we don't have to get angry about the fact that we're angry. It's just simply a cue that's showing up on the scene that's telling us something. And if we can be curious about it, we can figure out what that emotion is telling us. And it's usually about a different situation or a different belief than the one that we're actually responding to. So take anxiety as an example. Anxiety might show up onto the scene and it's a cue that might tell us something. So let's say you are walking up to the free throw line and you start to notice that your heart is racing and pounding and it feels like that's all you can focus on and you're struggling to think clearly. If that anxiety causes you to panic, you get outside that window of tolerance, you get anxious about the fact that you're anxious, then you're likely to miss that free throw. But if you can notice that anxiety and use that as a cue, I'm performing, and use that anxiety to help boost your experience, meaning that you can regulate through it and that anxiety can give you that little performance boost without flipping you above your window of tolerance, then that will actually show up to help you in your athletic performance, and you're more likely to make that free throw. So emotions can actually help us in our athletic experience. We don't want to go into shutdown mode, but if we get hijacked by that emotion and we get outside of our window of tolerance, then we actually experience that emotion negatively within our performance. Let me encourage you to be curious when you notice an emotion creeping up and view that as a cue that's just telling you something, and be that curious observer. So you can either notice that in the middle of the game, or if you don't have time in the middle of a game, then maybe in a post-game breakdown. But doing the work of curiosity and observation, getting kind of above the scene and surveying your emotional experience and what contributed to that, what was the activating event, that curiosity will allow you to learn for the future so that in future events, you'll be able to stay within your window of tolerance when that activating event occurs. My fourth strategy would be to look at how the window of tolerance plays out when the normal flow of the game stops. So that could be when someone's injured, or a penalty is called, or someone gets thrown out of the game, a timeout, something happens in the crowd that is distracting. Any of those are a halt to the normal flow of the game. And when that happens, our typical regulation pattern also can change up. And sometimes that allows our thoughts to catch up with us if we can just kind of go with the flow while we're actually playing. The whistle blows and our thoughts kind of creep up, and that is a point at which sometimes it's easy for us to get stuck in our head and we can either go into hyperarousal or hypoarousal. So for you as an athlete, or for coaches, for each individual player, to look at what happens in those seconds or minutes when a halt to the normal flow of the game happens is really important in widening that window of tolerance. What are the typical thoughts that go through your mind? Do you go to that all or nothing language? Are you likely to catastrophize in that moment? Does anger creep up? Is there something that you need to do to kind of ground yourself and bring you back into your body in that present moment? So being able to analyze what happens when the normal flow of the game stops, I think, is really important in understanding how to widen your window of tolerance when you're in the middle of gameplay and when there has been a halt to the normal flow of the game. So how are you going to recenter yourself when that halt happens? And what are small things that you can do during those seconds or minutes when a halt has happened that allow you to recenter yourself, bring you back into your body, and allow you to regulate so that your prefrontal cortex stays online, so that you widen that window of tolerance, which will allow you to have access to that executive function and that wise decision making that allows you to be the best athlete that you can. My fifth strategy would be to look at what your value system is and what your coach's value system is. Because if those value systems don't align, then they can trigger one another, and that is something that can get us outside of our window of tolerance. And so being able to have conversations about an individual player's value system within the game and how that plays out both individually and within connectedness of a team is really important. That allows us to have a conversation about, again, what those activating events might be that kick us out of our window of tolerance, and to have system-wide conversations about what are the team's value systems. Again, that allows each individual player to figure out how their value systems are going to match within the team value system. And that allows the team's window of tolerance to widen so that they can work together in healthy and productive ways to win the game. My sixth strategy is to just be honest about what's happening in life outside of the game. The reality is that games don't exist outside of our life. And as much as we want to put all of life in a container when we go out onto the field or the court, and sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, and the things that happen pre-game actually impact us in the middle of a game. I want to remind you all that we all have mental health in the same way that we all have physical health. Just as you would be proactive about your physical health and go to the doctor, make sure that you're eating right, go to the gym and lift, do training exercises, the same needs to be done for our mental health because the two impact one another. And so we can't just focus on our mental health or just focus on our physical health. We have to work both together. So how can you be proactive about your mental health in the same way that you as an athlete are proactive about your physical health? The more proactive you can be about your mental health, the healthier overall athlete you're going to be when you walk out for the game. So what can you as an athlete do or a coach do if you want to help a player to widen that window of tolerance? Well, I have several videos on ways to regulate yourself and strategies to widen that window of tolerance. So make sure that you check those videos out. But I want to encourage you individually as an athlete and the team as a whole to engage in mindfulness training. And that is incredibly important because those small shifts in thinking patterns or those small shifts in ability to regulate and stay within that window of tolerance can make a big impact on game day. So engaging in mindfulness training regularly as part of your training routine is really important. You can also do your own work individually. Like I said, we all have physical health and we all have mental health. So working on your mental health every day the same way you do with your physical health is really important to good athletic performance. Doing yoga can be really helpful for not only some of that mindfulness training, but just being able to practice regulating and being present in our body. So talk to your trainer and see if yoga might be an appropriate addition to your training that you're currently doing. Another thing that you can do to widen your window of tolerance is to practice the body scan. And with that, you're just going to start at your head and scan all the way down your body and notice what's happening in your body. So what emotions are you feeling? What physical sensations are you experiencing? What feels tense? What feels safe or calm in your body? Being able to notice those things is incredibly helpful. And you can use that body scan maybe when you're sitting on the bench pre-game or when you're outside of that normal flow of your game in order to help regulate yourself. And finally, be that curious observer of your own life. We can't change what we don't know. So be curious about what those activating events are. What are the thoughts, feelings, actions, or reactions from yourself or someone else that get you activated, that might spike anger or anxiety, panic, hypervigilance, or lead you to shut down or kind of get brain foggy and dissociate. Being very curious about those things allows you to do something about it, and we can suddenly change something because we know. When it comes to athletic performance and gameplay, there are so many things that we individually can't control, but we can control ourselves. And being able to be very intentional about making sure that the balance between our amygdala and prefrontal cortex is working so that we can stay physiologically regulated, so that we can widen that window of tolerance, as hard as that is, those are things that we can control. And doing that work, as hard or as uncomfortable as that is, can really make a difference in our athletic performance individually and as a team as a whole. And so again, coaches, let me encourage you to introduce this system-wide into your program, and this will impact each individual player on your team and the team collectively. And again, we have to practice it, just like we run drills, just like we go to the gym and work out. We have to continue to practice these in order for that muscle to be built so that we can handle increasingly difficult situations and regulate through increasingly difficult emotions. So show up for yourself, work on widening that window of tolerance, and watch how that will impact your life. If you are interested in learning more about your nervous system and how that impacts threats and perceptions of threat within the athletic world, or again, widening that window of tolerance, make sure to go find those playlists, and there's a lot more content there for you. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Poland & Associates, and my website, polandassociates.com, and make sure that you subscribe to this channel so that you won't miss future videos.